It's been a very trying week. That old devil is doing everything in his power to make me miserable. And so pray for me that I'll survive. She sat down. Her husband quickly got up in the testimony service and said, brothers and sisters, I want you to know she's not the easiest woman to get along with either. She was saying that the devil was giving her problems, and so he thought he was the devil. Well, that may be the case in a lot of marriages, right? I'm reminded of the husband who, after 50 years of marriage, somebody asked him, what was the secret for longevity of their relationship as a husband and wife? How did you survive for 50 years? He said, well, we've only had one fight. In all of 50 years in our marriage, we've only had one fight. So he was asked to elaborate on that statement, and he said, the fight started on our honeymoon, and I'm still waiting for it to end. Some of us may know what he's talking about, right? Thank God for wonderful marriages. All who are married this morning, and if you are here this morning and you're not married, don't turn me off, okay? Because I promise you I'm going to say some things that's going to help you as well. Okay, that's going to benefit you as an individual. That's going to benefit us as a church as well. Because all of us who are married, we understand that there are going to be problems in marriage. Can I get a witness? There are no perfect marriages. There are no perfect marriages. And the reason there are no perfect marriages is because there's a husband and a wife who are not perfect. Now, my wife and I, we've been married for 27 years. This July will be 27 years. Right? Okay. Just wanted to make sure. So this July will be 27 years. And I can say God has blessed us with a wonderful marriage. But I'm not going to be up here and stand up here and be so super spiritual and tell you we have never had a fight. We've had some fights. We've had some good ones. And we've had some bad ones. Not really fights, though, right? Maybe disagreements, okay? And I told her, when we got married July the 25th, 1992, I told her that her prerogative was to be wrong if she wanted to be wrong. And, she has that right to be wrong if she wants to be wrong. But it's usually me that's the problem. I think maybe we would have a whole lot better marriage if it were not for me. Because, the old pride and the old nature sometimes kind of gets in the way. And sometimes you have to say, I'm sorry. By the way, two of the hardest words in the English language. I'm sorry. Husbands, you better learn those two words. Wives, you better learn those two words. Because if you don't understand and learn those two words, your marriage is going to be in trouble. This week, I had to have a personal illustration. So this week, I had to apologize to my wife because of something that I said. And I had to say, son. You can tell I'm used to talking to Austin and Devin, right? Honey, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I didn't mean it the way that I said it, but I know the way that it came out, it did not sound good. And I had to say, honey, will you forgive me? And she said, I've already forgiven you. And, there has to be times like that in the marriage, right? And I'm not standing up here before you this morning telling you that your pastor and your pastor's wife marriage is perfect and it doesn't have any problems. Because I would be a liar if I did. But we all who are married, we all understand that there's going to be problems in marriage. Can I get a witness? The truth is, some of the so-called big sins that get the blame for marital difficulties many times is not really what's to blame. I believe after 27 years of ministry and 27 years of being married, I am convinced that the inability to resolve differences in our marriage is the number one culprit of divorce and marriage difficulties. Because we don't know how to resolve conflict. We don't know how to have a good fight. We don't know how to fight fair. And so contrary to popular belief, it's not how much you love each other that can best predict the future of your relationship, but how conflicts and disagreements are handled. That will determine the longevity of your marriage. Unfortunately, conflict is inevitable. Every marriage is going to have conflict. Every individual is going to face conflict. It cannot be avoided. And so if you want to have a good marriage, and I believe everybody that's married, you want to have a good marriage. And if you want to have a good marriage, you better learn to fight right. You better learn how to have a good fight and fight for your marriage. I had so much information that I wanted to share. I have divided this sermon into 2 parts, all right? And so we'll continue this next Sunday morning. But I want to give you several things this morning on how to have a good fight. First of all, I want you to see, and we'll get to James chapter 4 here in a moment, but I want you to see the case for fighting, first of all. The case for fighting. There are 2 myths that I want to debunk this morning. 2 myths about marital conflict. The first myth is this: good marriages don't have struggles. Can I tell you, that is a myth. Good marriages don't have struggles. There's a lot of people who believe that great marriages don't have relational battles. Well, I don't know where they're living, but they're not living in any of our homes. Because every marriage has relationship battles. 2 sinners living under the same roof. Guess what you're going to have when you put 2 sinners living under the same roof? You're going to have problems. You're going to have sins. You're going to have difficulties. You're going to have conflicts. You're going to have difficulties. Somebody said that it's like 2 married porcupines who move close together for warmth in the winter, and no matter how much they love each other, they're going to irritate each other from time to time. We're just like 2 porcupines in marriage. You know, there's going to be some good times in marriage, but there's going to be times where we aggravate each other, where we frustrate each other, where we just flat make our spouse angry and mad, and we hurt their feelings. And so this myth that good marriages don't have struggles needs to be debunked, because good marriages have struggles. You have problems. How we handle those difficulties and how we handle those problems is going to determine the kind of marriage that we're going to have. The second myth is this: not only do good marriages not have struggles, but number 2 is this: conflict hurts good marriages. I believe that's a myth. That conflict hurts good marriages. I believe conflict helps good marriages as long as you know how to fight fair. As long as you know how to have a good fight, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I believe the truth is most marriages are stronger because of conflict. I believe every one of us who's married this morning, you could say that your marriage is stronger today because of the conflicts that you had. And you worked out those conflicts. They were resolved in the right way. And as a result, you grew as a husband and as a wife. Let me give you 3 statements very quickly. The way that we handle the problems often can be the problem, more than the problems themselves. You know, when we have a conflict in marriage, that problem, by the way, have you ever understood when you and your spouse get into an argument, it's usually over something dumb, piddly, crazy, minor. If we had a record of every disagreement that we had in our marriages, and we wrote them down, most of those conflicts and disagreements that we have are over something very, very minor. It's almost like 2 kids in elementary school. And that's sometimes the way that we handle our conflicts. We act like little elementary students sometimes. Instead of putting our big boy britches on and acting like a grown man and acting like a grown woman, we act like children many times. And we're going to talk about some of those ways that we handle them here in just a moment, so just hang on. But the way that we handle the problems, more than the problems themselves, are often the problems, the bigger problems. The second statement I want to give you. Happiness is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with it. Happiness is not the absence of conflict. Man, if I could just stop having conflict, man, I would have joy. I would be happy if I could just stop having conflict. Well, good luck. Put on your little happy face and say happy, happy, happy. If you want, and you can say happy, happy, happy all you want. Conflict. And so happiness is not the absence of conflict, but rather it is the ability to cope with that conflict. Conflict can either improve your marriage or it can destroy your marriage. One of the two. And so I believe it's important for us to know how to fight right. I don't think there's any couple in here this morning you've never had a fight. I don't think there's any couple in here this morning that will never have a fight from here to eternity. You're going to have some disagreements. So I want to talk to you on how do you fight right? How do you fight right? How do you have a good fight in order to improve our marriage? I like what Dr. Ed Young said, and he said this, and I quote, "Sometimes marriage is like a duel. A duel. But when we learn how to successfully handle conflict, it becomes a duet. And the harmony that is produced is almost divine. Spouses must decide whether their marriage is going to be a duel or a duet." You have to decide what it's going to be. I mean, we can continue to duel and we can battle it out, battle royale, and we can battle it out, or we can be a duet and we can sing in harmony and make a wonderful marriage. But I do believe that there are some improper ways to handle conflict. I like, and this is borrowed, and I like what Bill Hybels actually gave, and these are 4 improper responses to marital conflict, okay? Now, you can decide whether you have responded one of these 4 ways. And we're going to get to James chapter 4 here in a moment, okay? But let me give you 4 improper responses to marital conflict. The first one is Eskimo style. Eskimo style. This is the cold shoulder method. You know, your spouse does something to you, and you give them the cold shoulder. You don't say a word. You just give them the cold shoulder, and there's a dispute, and the husband and wife go their separate way, and nobody says anything. This is the Eskimo style, the cold shoulder method. And what happens is they never deal with it properly. They have the cold shoulder method, and they negotiate around it, or maybe even avoid it, and they hope that things will thaw out. And so they give them the cold shoulder for a while, maybe a day, maybe 2, maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. And they hope everything's going to chill out. And they hope the chills will leave the air. In fact, with each new unresolved conflict, what they do is they add another layer of ice. So you give them the cold shoulder, you don't talk about it, you just kind of negotiate it and hope everything's going to work out. And then when the next conflict comes up, you give them the cold shoulder again. Then the next conflict, we give the cold shoulder again. And you understand, the more cold shoulders you give, the more ice it's going to build up. And the more problems you're going to have within your marriage. Where's the Barney Fifes in marriage? That's what we need in our marriages. We need some Barney Fifes. How many of you like Andy Griffith's show? It's the best. It's the best. It's a classic. I mean, I don't think you can be a Christian and go to heaven without watching. No, just kidding, just kidding. I love Barney. I love Barney. He's my favorite. And whenever I need a good laugh, I just watch Andy Griffith's show. Oh, Barney, his famous saying was what? Nip in the bud. Nip in the bud. Nip it. nip it, nip it, nip it in the bud. And that's what we need in our marriage. We need some husbands and wives who will just nip it in the bud. Instead of giving the Eskimo style and give them the cold shoulder, nip it in the bud. But then there's a second improper response. Not only the Eskimo style, but how about the cowboy style? Now, the cowboy style is this. This is how we deal with it. We deal with it by letting the bullets fly. We pull out the old gun, and we let the bullets fly, if you will. We disagree with our spouse. We both draw our 6-shooters, and we start firing off verbal bullets, if you will. And our mouth gets in the way, and our mouth gets us in trouble, and we handle it the cowboy style. I mean, it's time to release the anger, and it's time to vent the feelings and that we've been holding back, and all of a sudden we pull our 6-shooters out, and we start firing verbal bullets. Now, let me ask you, how's that worked out for you? Oh, that solves a lot of problems, doesn't it? That makes the marriage wonderful, doesn't it? Has anybody ever said anything that you regret because you were trying to do it cowboy style? All right, 3 of us, 4, 5, 6. Can I get a witness? Yeah. We've all been there, right? We throw off those verbal assaults, if you will. There's action and there's drama, but no results. A lot of bullets flying, but no results. And the problem with that, the problem with the cowboy style is this. So much damage is done with the cowboy style. Because I want to tell you, words you can never take back. Words you can never bring back. You may apologize. You may say you're sorry. And I don't know who came up with a statement, words and stones may break my bone, or sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I don't know who came up with that, but it's far from the truth. Words hurt. Words hurt. And I want to tell you, if you want to do damage in your marriage, do it cowboy style. Verbal assaults. And you begin just firing those verbal bullets, and you begin saying things that ultimately you're going to regret, but you cannot retrieve. You cannot take those things back at all. And they hurt. I guarantee you, every spouse that's here this morning, you have been hurt by your spouse because of something they said. And by the way, you might not have intended it to hurt them. And by the way, it might not have been just what you said, it might have been how you said it. Sometimes it's not what we say, it's how we say it. But we fire bullets. By the way, this is true not only in the marriage, but this is true in every area of life. You want to do damage to your children? Fire those verbal bullets. You want to do damage in the church? Hey, do it cowboy style. Pull out your 6-shooter and start firing away. Start firing away and shooting those bullets and talking about anybody and everybody you want to talk about that doesn't agree with you. Some things you don't like, and just start firing verbal bullets. If you want to hurt the kingdom and the work of God, start firing away. Pull it out. But all you're doing is hurting the kingdom of God. Hey, if you don't like something about somebody, pray for them. Pray for them. If you don't like something your spouse is doing, pray for them. Instead of pulling out the verbal gun and start firing those verbal bullets, pray for your spouse. Pray for that individual you don't agree with. Because I want to tell you, those verbal bullets are destroying homes, they're destroying marriages, they're destroying families, they're destroying children, they're destroying relationships, they're destroying churches, they're destroying our country. Cowboy style. Verbal. Just let the bullets fly. But then there's a third improper response. This is escape style. Escape style. We just want to get away. Calgon, take me away. And we want to escape from our problems. And so what we do when problems arise and there's conflict, we run from the problems. We become escape artists. And we run from our problems. We escape to mamas. I'm talking about married couples. We escape to mamas because mama's going to understand me. Mama going to take up for me. Mama got my back. And so what do? We escape to mamas. We escape to the gym. I'll take out my frustration. I'll take out my stress. You just put 450 pounds on that bar, bless God, and I'll take my stress out. And we go to the gym. Or maybe that was 50, not 450. We go to the gym. Maybe we go to the computer. We go to the backyard. We go to work. But we run from our problems. It is conflict avoidance at best. And we try to avoid conflict. By the way, issues are never faced and problems are never solved this way. When you run from your problems, you will never solve your problems. By the way, can I just give you this statement as well? Don't attack the person, always attack the problem. Attack the problem, not the person. You see, many times when we have problems in any relationship, we want to attack that person because it makes us feel good when we run them down. It makes us feel like we're on top of the world when we can say something negative and derogatory toward them. But it never solves problems. So attack the problem and not the person. But we tried escape style. The fourth style, and then we'll get to James chapter 4, is manhandler style. Some try Eskimo style, some try cowboy style, some try escape style, and then some try manhandler style. What is that? This is where spouses react to conflict by allowing verbal assaults to escalate ultimately into physical violence. You know what happens there? It only creates deeper and deeper pain. Words are bad enough, but it results to something physical. There's probably pain that will never be taken away. But some handle it manhandler style. And so that's the case for fighting. That's kind of my introduction, but my first point. But now I want to give you some biblical advice very quickly on how to have a good fight. We see the case for fighting, but number 2, in James chapter 4, I want you to see the cause of fighting. The cause of fighting. Go with me to James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And since this is a 2-part series, if time runs out, then I'll just cut it off, all right? And we'll pick it up next week. James chapter 4, notice verses 1 through 3. From when wars and fightings among you, come they not hence, even of your lust that war in your members? Ye lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lust. Here, I don't have time to really go into the background, but James is speaking of 3 different wars that we as human beings, we battle with. 3 battles and wars that are going on in this world. Number 1, we are at war with each other. Number 2, we are at war with ourselves. And number 3, we are at war with God. Those are 3 battles that are going on in our life. I don't care who you are. There's 3 battles that go on in our life. We are at battle and at war with each other, with ourselves, and at war with God. What causes fightings and quarrels among you, James asked there in verse 1. He says there in verse 1, from when or where does these wars and fightings come from? Where do they come from? Matter of fact, go back to the original, it ultimately gives you the answer. And basically James is saying they come from within, the desires from within you. Where comes all these battles? Where comes these quarrelings? They come from within you because you are at war with somebody else. You are at war with yourself, or you are at war with God. It is a battle going on. There is a war that is raging. But we've got to understand something, and I mentioned this last week. Our enemy is not our spouse. Our enemy is not our children. Our enemy is not our parents. Our enemy is not somebody in the church. Our enemy is outside these doors, and his name is Satan. His name is Satan. And I tell you, we forget that so many times. We believe our enemy is somebody else because they've done something that we don't like. And as a result, we get upset. We start firing those verbal bullets. We've got to understand that the reason we have those fightings and quarrelings is because of the desires within us. Those things that war in our own members. Matter of fact, the Greek word there in verse 1 for lust, or literally the word desires there, is the word that we get our English word hedonism from. Hedonism. Hedonism is simply, and I give this definition, hedonism is devotion to pleasure as a way of life. Do another. Not just in our marriage, but how we are to get along with one another. And by the way, I don't have time, but James chapter 3, I encourage you to go back and read it. The tongue is a big problem for a lot of people. And the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. It's like a fire. It destroys, it defiles, it spreads. And now in chapter 4, he's talking about how to get along with each other. And he says the root of the problem is our selfish desires. The reason you have problems within your marriage is because you or your spouse have selfish desires, or both, and probably both. Selfish desires. And from those selfish desires come the desire ultimately to fulfill whatever pleasures we want. That's hedonism. The essence of all sin is selfishness. The root of all sin is selfishness. No matter what sin you commit, the reason we commit those sins is because we have selfishness in our heart. And that is the root of every sin. And as Christians, we are not to be slaves to those desires, but we can overcome those things if we walk in the Spirit. Walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the what? Lust of the flesh. So our problem is when we have conflict within the marriage, it's because one or both are not walking in the Spirit. When you're at odds with somebody else, it's because one or the other is not walking with the Spirit. When you're at odds with somebody at work or two believers, it's because one or the other or both are not walking in the Spirit. As Christians, we should not be slaves to those desires, but we can overcome we will not overcome if we fail to walk in the Spirit and be obedient to God's Word. And so ultimately the cause of fighting is, James said, selfish desires. It's time for some of us to search our heart and realize that most of our issues and our problems are because of our own selfishness, the desires within us. And by the way, I think that we have desires, and I can sum it up this way. We have desires for three things. Number one, there's a desire for power. And you can relate these to your marriage. There's a desire for power, the desire for control. I want to be in control. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Now, I understand he ought to be the head of the house. I know that's what God designed. But nobody's going to tell me what to do. She's not going to tell me what to do. He's not going to tell me what to do. And so that desire for power. But then there's also not only just a desire for power, but there's a desire to be provocative. A desire to be provocative. What do I mean by that? They just like to push buttons. I guarantee you every one of us know what buttons to push. And when I say that, you know exactly what I mean. You want to frustrate your spouse? You know what buttons to push. And you know exactly when to push them. And you know how hard to push them. And you know which buttons they are to push. Just like to stir up problems. I think live for fighting. I think some people actually live for fighting. You know, they want conflict. They want desires. Or they desire that conflict. And my mic was cutting in and out, so I'm going to switch that. But they desire conflict. I mean, they're not happy unless they're fussing with somebody. Have you ever been around negative people? And you get around those people and nothing is right. Nothing is ever right. Nothing is ever right. Jesus could come down in human flesh and we would find a problem with Jesus. Always looking for the negative. Always looking for the critical. By the way, that's dangerous. That's not a happy life. I don't know about you, but I don't like to be around negative, critical people that are always finding fault. I don't want to be married to them. I don't want to be around them. And by the way, it's amazing to me how birds of a feather flock together. Isn't it amazing how people flock together with those kind of spirits and those kind of attitudes? And sometimes it's amazing how sometimes they come together and be married. And then you've got two critical people by nature. You talking about a happy home? That's not a happy home. That's a home that is headed for trouble, a marriage that is headed for trouble. But some just have a desire to be provocative. They want to push buttons. And then some have a desire for possessions. You want something, but you don't get it. And when you want something and you don't get it, then you go pout. Or you pull out the 6-shooter. Or you give them the cold shoulder. Or you do something else. But they desire for possessions. They want something, but they don't get it. And our old flesh, I want to tell you, it will fight, it will lobby, it will argue to get what it wants every time. Because of our selfish desires, because of our selfish nature. And we let our selfish desires drive us to get what we want rather than pray about what God wants for us. And so there we see the cause of fighting in verses 1 through 3. But I want you to notice in verses 7 through 10, and I'm going to stop here with these verses, I want you to see the cure for fighting. What is the cure for fighting? If we're going to have a good fight, what is the cure? What is the cure? And I'm going to give these to you, and I'm going to give them to you in rapid fire succession, and I'm going to give them to you quickly, and I'm going to come back and review it next week, and then I'm going to give you something else that's going to be very helpful for you. But I believe there's a cure for fighting. I believe there's a cure in our marriages on how to fight fair and how to have a good fight when conflicts arise. And James gives us this advice in verses 7 through 10. Notice with me in verse 7. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted, and mourn, and weep, and let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. I believe in this passage, and I'm just going to give them to you quickly, and I'm going to come back next week and talk about them in more detail. But I believe there's 5 cures for fighting here in these verses. Number 1, submit to God. You want to cure your fighting? Submit to God. Place yourself under God's authority and let God call the shots. I promise you that will help your marriage if you will just simply submit to God. And if there's any area of your life that is kept back from God and you don't give it to Him, I promise you there's going to be battles. There's going to be battles. And so first of all, you've got to submit to God. Second of all, you've got to resist the devil. And by the way, you can't resist the devil without submitting to God. You try resisting the devil without God. See how it works. See how that works out for you. I'm pretty strong, Pastor. I'm spiritually strong. I think I can handle Satan. Go ahead and try. And try resisting the devil without submitting to God, and you'll find out very quickly how that works out for you. and come back and let me know. Hey, don't let the devil get a foothold in your life. Resist the devil. Recognize who the real enemy is. I said that earlier, but recognize who the real enemy is. The enemy is not in your bedroom. The enemy is not your spouse. The enemy is not your children. The enemy is not those sitting beside you. The enemy is not here at Crosspointe Church. The enemy is outside those doors, and his name is Satan. It reminds me of an old story of two American soldiers in Vietnam. And while eating lunch in the mess hall, they exchanged some very harsh words. And they got into a big fight. And the sergeant grabbed these two soldiers by the collars, took them outside. And he pointed to the fields outside, and he said, "Gentlemen, the enemy is out there and not in here. The enemy is out there and not in here." And can I remind you, the enemy is out there. It's not in your bedroom. It's not in your home. It's not in the church. The enemy is out there, and his name is Satan. And we better learn that very quickly. His name is Satan. And he's out to destroy you. He's out to destroy your marriage. He's out to destroy your family. And so if we're going to cure our fighting, if we're going to have a good fight, we've got to submit to God. Number 2, we've got to resist the devil. Number 3, we've got to draw near to God. Notice what he says. After he says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you," then it says, "Draw nigh to God." Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Not only must you submit to God, but you must draw nigh to him. I have learned a long time ago, the closer we get to God, the closer we get to one another. The closer we get to God, the closer we get to one another. You see, if I will focus upon my relationship with God, my wife will focus upon her relationship with God, and both of us draw closer to God, I promise you, we will draw closer to one another. Every time. Money back guarantee. If you want a better marriage, draw nigh to God. Submit to God. And when you draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh to you. Because here's the bottom line. Your relationship with your spouse will never be right until your relationship with God is what it needs to be. You can only love your spouse to the degree that you love God. And so if you want a strong marriage, draw nigh to God. Draw nigh to God. By the way, that would solve a lot of issues in every relationship, right? That would solve a lot of issues. Whether it's your relationship with your children, which we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. Whether it's a relationship with a coworker. Whether it's a relationship with somebody, Crosspointe Church. No matter what that relationship issue may be, if we will draw nigh to God, it will solve a lot of conflicts. And I found out a long time ago the reason there's a lot of conflicts is because somebody's not drawing nigh to God. And the reason sometimes we have a critical spirit is because we're not drawing nigh to God. He says, draw near to God. And then he says, number 4, cleanse your hands and purify your hearts. Cleanse your hands and purify your hearts. By the way, this is how you draw near to God. Cleanse your hands, purify your hearts. My mom and daddy used to say when it was time for supper, "Come on in." We were out playing. "Come on in and wash your hands. Clean up." And that's exactly what James is saying. In order to draw nigh to God, we gotta wash our hands. We got to purify our hearts. We got to make sure that we are clean before God. We've got to search our heart and know and see if there be any wicked way in me and allow God to search our hearts and repent of our sins and to make it right with God. That's how we draw nigh to God, to cleanse our hands and to purify our hearts. And then he says, number 5, we've got to humble ourselves. Notice what he says in verse 10, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." God will exalt you if we will just simply humble ourselves. And if we will do these 5 things, we'll come back and look at them again in more detail next week. But if we will do these 5 things and do what is instructed in these verses, I want to tell you, the conflicts will lessen. The conflicts could actually cease if we all did it at all times. I believe conflict and struggles can be dealt with in a biblical, logical, sensible, lovable way, and the marriage only becomes stronger through the conflict. So I want to ask you, husband and wife, how's it going at home? How are the conflicts? Are you fighting fair? Are you having a good fight? Because there's going to be conflicts. It's inevitable. There are going to be conflicts. But how we handle those conflicts is going to determine how strong our marriage is going to be. And you can take that and you can apply that to every relationship in your life and make application. Let me ask you, how is it with your relationships? I know we honed in on husband and wife relationship, but how is it with your relationship with your spouse, and how is it with others? May God help us to understand the biblical way to resolve conflict, to handle conflict. And if we will submit to God, and if we will resist the devil, if we will draw nigh to God, if we will cleanse our hands and purify our hearts, if we will humble ourselves, then God will raise us up and God will exalt us. Next Sunday, I want to talk more specifically about some conflict resolution skills. What does it take to resolve conflict? Whether it's in the marriage or whether it's in any other relationship. What does it take to resolve conflict? Because I want to tell you, I think there's a lot of people that don't know how to do it biblically. And so we're going to take it and we're going to apply it to the marriage, and we're going to apply it to every relationship in our home and in our life. So I want to ask you this morning, how are you handling conflicts? Are you drawing nigh to God? Are you resisting the devil? Are you submitting to God? May God help us to know how to handle conflicts in a biblical way. Would you bow your heads with me? Heads bowed and eyes closed.